I was driving up the winding road toward my parents' home for Christmas night in Evergreen, with a familiar tightness in my chest. Snow drifted across the pavement in long white ribbons, and the pine trees glowed under the porch lights, like they were posing for a postcard. On the radio, a soft jazz station played something warm and slow, the kind of music people imagine when they picture a peaceful holiday. But peace was never something my family knew how to hold. I had just parked in front of the house when something inside me whispered that this night would be different. I could not explain why. Maybe it was the quiet, or the cold, or the way my hands shook a little when I turned off the engine. Before I stepped out of the car, I caught myself thinking about all the women who listened to stories like mine, while folding laundry or sitting in bed or cooking dinner. I wondered if any of them ever felt that strange tightening before a moment that would change their life. If you are listening right now, I am curious where you are and what you are doing. For me, I was sitting in my car, staring at the front door of my parents' house, when everything started to shift inside me. I pushed the thought away and went inside. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon filled the house. The dining table was set with the old red and gold Christmas linens, the ones Mom only brought out for special occasions. Dad sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff and proud, the same as always. Ethan, my 33-year-old brother, stood beside him with a glass of wine, laughing too loudly at something no one else heard. He was glowing with that easy confidence he had carried his entire life, the confidence my parents never stopped feeding. The golden child, the savior, the son who could do no wrong. I stepped inside, and Mom brushed past me to throw her arms around Ethan. She kissed his cheek, touched his hair, and told him how proud she was. Dad clapped him on the back and joked about how Ethan would take over the world any day now. Their voices lifted and circled around him like he was some sort of holiday miracle. I stood there for a moment, holding my coat in one hand, waiting for someone to look at me. They did not. Rebecca, my 21-year-old sister, finally made eye contact from across the room. Her smile flickered, thin and half-formed. She had always been the quiet one, sweet but easily influenced and far too eager for approval. She avoided my gaze after that, tugging her phone out to check a message. When I reached her side, she leaned close and whispered that she would head out after dinner to meet some friends. She said it quickly, like she was confessing something she did not want anyone else to hear. Her fingers trembled when she slipped her phone back into her purse. Dinner unfolded like every other holiday we had ever had. My parents bragged about Ethan. My mom bragged about how he had almost gotten a promotion at his company even, though she could not remember the title. My dad repeated a story about Ethan helping a neighbor fix a fence, stretching it into something heroic. Every time I tried to speak, the conversation shifted away. They did not even notice. Rebecca barely touched her food. She kept twisting a napkin in her lap. By the time dessert was served, my chest felt tight again. A heaviness spread through me that made breathing feel like work. I excused myself, hugged Rebecca, nodded toward Ethan, and kissed my mom on the cheek. Dad barely raised his eyes from his plate. The snow had begun to fall more heavily when I stepped back outside. I brushed flakes from my hair and walked to my car, feeling colder than the wind around me. The drive home to Denver took almost an hour. The road curved through the mountains, and the headlights cut long silver paths into the dark. I kept seeing Rebecca's face in my mind, that thin smile, that tremble. But I told myself it was not my responsibility to fix whatever was happening. I had spent too many years filling that role already. Tonight, I would go home, lock my door, make a cup of hot tea, and sleep. But sleep did not hold for long. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone exploded with noise. The ringtone shattered the silence and jerked me awake. I reached for the phone on my nightstand, my heart already pounding. Dad's name lit up the screen. The call kept buzzing. Then another. Then another. When I finally answered, his voice blasted through so loud I pulled the phone back. Amy sent $20,000 right now to save your sister. If you do not send it this minute, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? Dead to me. Mom was screaming in the background. She begged me to fix this like I always had. She said Rebecca was in trouble. She said if I did not pay, everything would fall apart. The noise from both of them overlapped and crashed into my ear like a storm. For a moment, I could not breathe. 12 years of being their safety net rose up inside me like a tide every time I rescued them. Every time I covered for Ethan. Every time I sacrificed something of my own to keep them comfortable. It all hit at once, and something inside me snapped clean. I put the phone against my ear and spoke with a calm I had never felt before. Then call your golden child. Let him save her for once. The silence lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt like a lifetime. Then my dad started shouting again, his voice raw and furious. I did not listen. I pressed the power button until the screen went black. I pulled the blanket around me and lay back down. My heart was still racing, but I felt something new, something light. Something like freedom. I slept hard until morning. At 7:30, I reached for my phone again. The screen blinked to life, flooded instantly with missed calls and messages. Before I could scroll through any of them, another call came in, a number I did not recognize. I hesitated for only a moment before answering. This is the Reno Police Department calling for Amy Whitford. I sat up in bed, the cold air from the window brushing my shoulders, and felt the world shift beneath my feet. The voice on the other end continued speaking, steady and official, and in that moment, I knew the night before had only been the beginning. I took a long breath, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. The line stayed open for a moment, as if the officer expected me to say something first. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear and tried to steady my breath. The air in my bedroom felt cold and thin, almost brittle, like it might crack if I moved too quickly. The officer repeated his name, Officer Daniel Rourke from Reno, Nevada, and his voice had that calm, practiced firmness you only hear from people who deal with emergencies every single day. He told me that my sister Rebecca had been taken into custody in the early morning hours. He said she had been detained outside a club near downtown Reno after failing to pay a bill of $7,500. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the frost forming on the inside of my window, trying to process each word. My throat tightened. My mind jumped back to her faint smile at dinner and the way she kept twisting her napkin. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. I asked him what had happened. He explained that after leaving our parents' home in Evergreen, Rebecca had driven with a group of friends toward Reno. She had told the club staff that she could cover everything. According to witnesses, she had laughed and thrown her arm around a friend, announced that she had it all taken care of, that it was her night, her treat. She had ordered rounds of top-shelf cocktails, bottles of champagne, plates of food, more drinks, more bottles, all of it spiraling into that enormous bill. Officer Rourke paused for a moment before continuing. Earlier that evening, Ethan had given Rebecca a credit card and told her she could use it for whatever she wanted. He had told her the card had a limit of $35,000. He had told her to go enjoy herself. When the club tried to run the charge near closing time, the bank flagged it. The card was linked to outdated identification information from years ago, information that still listed my name instead of theirs. The bank sent a text to confirm whether the transaction was legitimate. I remembered that text flashing on my screen. I had been half asleep and barely aware of what I was looking at. I had seen a charge for $7,500 in Reno. And I had reacted the only way a person would react at 3 o'clock in the morning. I tapped the option that said the card was stolen. I had turned my phone off before the confirmation message even finished. Sending. The club staff had asked Rebecca for identification when the charge was denied. That was when everything unraveled. She had handed over an ID with my name and my face from years ago with minor changes that were not obvious until someone looked closely. According to the officer, the staff had immediately called security and then the police. Rebecca had insisted that she was only doing what she had been told and that Ethan had arranged everything. I pressed my palm to my forehead and let out a slow breath. My voice felt thin when I finally asked if she was safe. Officer Rourke said she was shaken but uninjured. He also said the club would be pressing charges unless immediate payment was arranged through proper channels. I felt my stomach knot. This was exactly why my parents had called me in the middle of the night. Not because they cared about what Rebecca had done to herself. Not because they wanted to tell me the truth. They wanted the money. They wanted me to make it all disappear, like I had done so many times before. There was a long pause as the officer shuffled some papers. Then he said something that made my skin go cold. He said that there was another matter connected to the situation, something involving my brother Ethan, something that could not be discussed over the phone. He asked if I could come to Reno as soon as possible. For a moment, I could not answer. My hand trembled around the phone. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Every instinct inside me told me to keep my distance, to stay in Denver, lock my door, drink some coffee, and pretend none of this had anything to do with me. But I knew better. I knew that if Ethan's name was involved, the trouble was far deeper than what had happened at that club. I asked if my parents had been informed. Officer Work said yes, they had been contacted earlier, but neither of them had answered follow-up calls. They had left one voicemail and had not responded since. That did not surprise me. They never answered when responsibility was required. They only answered when they needed something. The officer asked again if I could come in person. His tone had shifted slightly. It was still professional, but there was something underneath it. Something like urgency. Something like concern. I told him I understood and that I would make arrangements. He thanked me, confirmed the address of the precinct, and ended the call. I stayed in bed for a long moment after the line went silent. My hand rested on my chest, feeling the quick, uneven rhythm of my breath. The sky outside my window had brightened to a pale gray. Snow dusted the balcony. Cars moved slowly along the street below. Everything looked peaceful. Everything felt wrong. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and sat there, staring at the carpet. My mind kept circling back to Rebecca passing that ID across the bar, smiling too wide, pretending she belonged in a place she did not. I imagined her terrified face when she realized she could not pay. I imagined her calling Mom, hearing panic instead of comfort. I imagined her whispering that Ethan had told her she could use the card, that Ethan had said everything would be fine. I had never wanted to see my sister in trouble, but trouble had a way of finding her. Or maybe trouble had a way of finding anyone who trusted Ethan too much. I stood up and went to the kitchen. The coffee maker clicked and hummed. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and stared out the window. Evergreen was a little over an hour away. Reno was almost 8. Snow made both drives worse, but distance had never protected me from my family's chaos. It had only delayed it. I rinsed the mug, grabbed my coat, and stuffed a small bag with essentials. Wallet, keys, charger, a folder of old documents I had kept for years without quite knowing why. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped outside. My breath came out in white clouds. As I got into the car, the quiet pressed around me again. The same quiet I had felt before Christmas dinner. The same quiet that hinted something was shifting. I turned the engine on and placed my phone in the console. Just before I pulled out of the parking lot, the phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another piece of the story waiting to drop. I hesitated, then answered, bracing myself for whatever came next. A woman answered on the other end, and it took me half a second to recognize my own mom through the shaking in. Her voice. She did not even say hello. She went straight into crying and gasping and telling me that I had broken her heart. She said Rebecca was sitting in some filthy holding room in Reno, terrified and alone. And all she needed was for me to stop being stubborn and send the money so this nightmare would end. I listened without saying anything for a moment. The phone pressed to my ear, the engine idling quietly beneath me. Mom kept circling the same lines. If you had just done what a good daughter does, this would all be over. If you really cared about your family, you would not make your sister suffer. Your dad is beside himself. Rebecca might never recover from this humiliation. It was like every guilt trip from my childhood had been bundled together and poured into my ear. I could almost see her pacing the kitchen, one hand pressed to her chest, the other waving in the air, looking to my dad for backup. I asked her if she had spoken to the police. She said they had called, but that they just wanted money, and that she did not understand half of what they said. She said all that mattered was getting Rebecca out and keeping the family name clean. I asked her why they needed $20,000 instead of just paying the club bill of $7,500. There was a brief stutter in her words. She said there were fees, legal fees, penalties, that it all added up quickly, that these things were complicated, and the important part was not the details, but the solution. Something in me cooled when she said that. I told her I was driving up to Evergreen. I said I would not talk about money over the phone and that we would discuss everything face to face. She did not like that answer. She tried to pull me back into the old script, saying there was nothing to discuss, only a problem to pay off. I told her I would be there in an hour and ended the call before she could. Drag me into another emotional knot. The drive up the mountain felt different that day. The snow from the night before had settled into a thin crust along the shoulders of the road. Pine trees leaned toward the sky, heavy with white. Cars moved carefully along the two-lane highway, their tires whispering over the asphalt. Inside my car, the heater hummed and the dashboard glowed a soft orange. My hands were steady on the wheel. My chest still felt tight, but there was something solid under the fear now. A thin line of anger that kept getting clearer the closer I got to my parents' house. When I turned onto their street, everything looked peaceful. Little houses with wreaths on the doors, strings of lights drooping along gutters. My parents' driveway had not been fully cleared, only 2 narrow tracks carved through the snow. I parked in the same spot where I had stood less than 24 hours earlier, still wearing a fake smile after dinner, still pretending that I did not see the way they erased me from their picture of the perfect Whitford family. Mom opened the door before I even knocked. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she held a crumpled tissue in one hand. The smell of old coffee and reheated ham drifted out behind her. She grabbed my arm as soon as I stepped inside, her voice dropping into a pleading tone. She said the bank had frozen the card. She said the police were exaggerating. She said everything could go away if I would just do what I had always done and come through for the family. Dad was at the dining table, hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at a cold plate of food he had not touched. His jaw was tight, that familiar clench that meant he was angry, but trying to look like he was in control. He did not stand up when I came in. He just looked at me with eyes that were more tired than I remembered and told me that my little outburst at 3 a.m. had been childish and cruel. He said, "Good people do not turn their backs on blood." I stood near the doorway and let their words wash over me without moving. Closer. I asked them again why they needed $20,000 when the bill at the club was for $7,500. Mom waved her hand and said there were additional charges. Dad muttered that there were things I did not understand about legal, settlements, and discretion. Neither of them gave me anything concrete. Every answer was smoke. I felt something heavy and cold settle in my stomach. It had always been like this with them. They expected me to hand over money first and trust their version of the story later. For years, I had done exactly that. No questions, no boundaries, just quiet transfers from my account into whatever fire they had started that week. My career has grown. My salary has risen, but my savings had always been bleeding out somewhere in this house. My eyes drifted toward the sideboard near the kitchen where my mom kept the mail. A messy stack of envelopes leaned against a ceramic bowl. Most were the usual junk. Bright colors, flyers, a charity request, but a few had the stern, uniform look of official letters. Thick paper, bank logos, windowed envelopes. My heart gave a small, hard thump in my chest, while Mom went on about how Rebecca had always been a sensitive girl and how humiliation might scar her for life. I stepped toward the stack and started sorting through it. Mom snapped at me not to rummage through her mail, then tried to soften it by saying it was all just boring bills, nothing important. That only made me look closer. Near the middle of the pile, I saw Ethan's name in bold letters on a notice from a finance company. I did not recognize. It mentioned late payment and possible collection. The amount due was written out as $35,000. The paper felt heavy in my hand. My mouth went dry. I held it up and asked my parents when they were planning to mention that my golden brother was buried in debt. Dad's face twisted. He said it was under control, that it was a temporary setback. Ethan had some investments that were going to come through any day now. Mom stepped in front of me and tried to take the letter, saying I did not need to worry about it. Behind that envelope, another one caught my eye. This one carried the name of a bank I knew too well. There was a line across the top that read, "Notice of reverse mortgage adjustment." The letter listed my parents' names and the amount of $140,000. I felt the room tilt a little as I read it. I had known they were living mostly on Dad's pension, but I had believed their house was the one solid thing they still had. I asked them when they had taken out a reverse mortgage on the house. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. Dad said it was none of my concern. He said parents did what they had to do to keep their family afloat. He said I had no right to judge decisions I knew nothing about. I reminded them I had been the one wiring money for years to cover gaps I did not create. I asked if the reverse mortgage was used to pay off more of Ethan's mistakes. Neither of them answered. Mom turned away, fiddling with a dish towel. Dad stared at the wall. I could feel a slow burn rising in my chest. Not the wild anger that explodes and then fizzles out, but a steady flame that had been starving for air for far too long. I set the letters down on the table and told them what Officer Rourke had said about Rebecca. I described the club, the fake ID, the card linked to my old information, the charge that had triggered the bank text at 3 a.m. Mom flinched when I mentioned the ID. She told me not to make such a big deal about it. She said Ethan had only been trying to help Rebecca feel more grown, that he had wanted her to fit in with her friends. She said it was just a silly mistake, that kids did things like that all the time. She made it sound like Ethan had lent her a jacket, not my identity. I asked her if she understood what it meant for someone to walk into a bar with my name on a piece of plastic and rack up charges the way Rebecca had done. I asked her if she realized that if I had not marked the transaction as stolen, those $7,500 would have landed squarely on me, on top of all the other things I had already carried. She blinked at me, then said that Amy always landed on her feet, that I had a good job and solid credit, and that these things did not hurt me the way they could hurt Ethan or Rebecca. In her mind, my stability made me fair game. I felt something close behind my ribs. It was like hearing my role in the family spoken out loud for the first time. I was not a daughter to them. I was a resource. My gaze went back to the pile of mail. A smaller envelope lay at the very bottom, slightly crumpled, as if it had been opened and shoved there in a hurry. The bank logo on the corner made my skin prickle. My name sat in the center in capital letters, Amy Whitford. The word notice of delinquency ran across the top. The date printed on it was from 4 years earlier. My fingers tightened on the paper. The room went very quiet in my head. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the faint hum of the refrigerator. I looked up at my parents, still bickering over what I should do to save Rebecca, and realized there were entire chapters of this story that I had never been allowed to read. I lowered my eyes back to that envelope with my name on it and slowly slid my thumb under the knowing that whatever was inside was going to change everything. I thought I knew about how deep their betrayal went. I slid my thumb under the edge of that envelope and eased it open, trying not to tear the paper. The letter inside was folded into thirds, the way banks always do it. My name was printed across the top in bold, and beneath it a line that read, Notice of delinquency, dated from 4 years earlier. The account number did not match anything I recognized. The balance due was several $1,000s, enough to make my stomach clench. I read the letter once, then again more slowly. It said the account was opened in my name, at my parents' address in Evergreen. It mentioned missed payments. It suggested that I contact them immediately to avoid going into collections. It was the kind of letter that would have made me panic if I had seen it in 2020. Only I had never seen it. They had. I looked up from the paper and asked my parents when they planned to tell me that there was an account in my name that had gone delinquent. Mom shrugged, her shoulders tense and tight. She said something about clerical errors and how banks made mistakes all the time. Dad glared at me and said I was overreacting, that if there had been a real problem, I would have heard about it by now. His voice had that familiar edge that warned me not to push further, but I was done obeying those warnings. I folded the letter and slid it into my bag. I told them I would not be handing over $20,000. Not that day. Not by phone. Not by transfer, not at all, until I understood what they had been doing with my name and my credit behind my back. Dad started shouting again, calling me ungrateful. Mom clutched the edge of the counter and told me I was tearing the family apart. I let their words hang in the air and turned toward the door. The cold hit my face when I stepped outside. It felt almost welcome. It cleared my head. I walked to my car with that envelope burning in my bag like a hot coal. When I shut the door and started the engine, my hands were shaking so hard, I had to take a moment before putting the car in gear. On the way back to Denver, I kept thinking about one person. Julia Marks. We had gone to college together at Colorado State. Back then, Julia had been the one everyone went to for help with anything money-related. Budgeting, student loans, tax questions. She always said she wanted to be the kind of lawyer who could protect regular people from getting crushed by the fine print. The last time I had checked her social media, she was working as a financial attorney in downtown Denver. At a red light, I used a voice command to call her. When she answered, her voice sounded exactly the same. Bright and warm, with that underlying steel that made you feel like she could take on a whole bank if she had to. I told her a small piece of what was happening, keeping my voice steady by sheer force. I mentioned the delinquency notice, and the fact that I had never seen it until that morning. There was a pause. Then she asked if I could come to her office that afternoon. Her tone shifted from friendly to professional in an instant. That alone scared me almost as much as the letter. By the time I reached Denver, the sky had gone from pale gray to a washed-out blue. The city streets were slushy and wet. I drove to her building, parked in the garage, and rode the elevator up with my heart lodged in my throat. Julia met me in the lobby outside her suite. She hugged me once, quick and tight, then stepped back and really looked at my face. She did not bother with small talk. We sat down in her office, a clean space with a simple desk, 2 chairs, and a small plant that had seen better days. She asked me to hand over every letter I had brought. I passed her the delinquency notice, the reverse mortgage statement I had slipped into my bag when my parents were not looking, and the late payment letter with Ethan's name on it. She scanned each one, her eyes moving quickly. Then she turned to her computer and said she was going to pull my full credit report. She explained, in simple terms, that it would show every account ever opened under my Social Security number, along with payment history, balances, and any derogatory marks. I nodded, even though my chest felt like someone had wrapped a belt around it and pulled hard. It took only a few minutes for the report to be generated, but the wait felt longer. I watched Julia's face as she read through the lines. Her expression hardened, her eyebrows pulled together. She leaned closer to the screen, then sat back and let out a slow exhale. She told me that my report showed 2 credit lines opened within the last several years that did not match anything I had described as mine. One was opened in late 2018, the other in early 2020. Both were at banks I had never used. Both listed my name, my Social Security number, and my parents' address in Evergreen. Both had gone delinquent, then been brought current, then fallen behind again. The pattern looked exactly like someone juggling payments with borrowed money. My mouth felt dry. I asked her if there was any chance this could be a simple mistake. She shook her head. She said banks did not usually attach the wrong Social Security number by accident, especially not twice. She clicked into the details and pointed out that the electronic signature on the applications looked the same on both, and that the handwriting on the scanned forms, where it appeared, had a certain slant to it. I stared at the screen. The slant looked familiar. Left to right, slightly downward. The way Ethan had written his name on birthday cards and job applications when we were younger. The way he had signed a thank you note to me once when I had paid off one of his old parking tickets. Julia asked if anyone else had access to my Social Security card or old copies of my ID. I thought about the drawer in my parents' hallway where my mom kept documents. I thought about the way she had brushed off my questions that morning, how she had tried to shoo me away from that stack of mail. I thought of Ethan walking into that house whenever he wanted, moving through it like it all belonged to him. I felt the truth land in my chest with a heavy, undeniable weight. It was not just Rebecca waving around a fake ID in Reno. This had been going on for years. Ethan had not just borrowed my identity for a wild night. He had used it like a tool, maybe like a weapon. For a moment, my vision blurred. I leaned back and pressed my fingertips against my eyes until the sting eased. 12 years of emergencies flashed through my mind, one after another. The college tuition I had paid without asking questions. The credit cards I had cleared when my parents said they were in trouble. The random transfers. The constant little crises that always seemed to center around Ethan, and yet somehow landed on my shoulders. I heard Julia's voice come through the haze, calm and steady. She said this was serious, but not hopeless. She said we could dispute the accounts, file fraud claims, and start the process of clearing my name. She also said it would not be quick. It would involve paperwork, patience, and possibly more conflict with my family than I was already facing. I nodded, but the words felt far away. My mind kept returning to Rebecca. She had walked into that club with an ID in my name and a card tied to accounts I had never opened. She had done it because Ethan told her she could. She believed him when he said everything would be fine. The realization clawed at me. Rebecca was not just the latest screw-up in a long line of screw-ups. She was the latest casualty in a pattern of using me as a shield. When Ethan got in too deep, he hid behind my stability. When my parents ran out of options, they leaned on my credit the way they had leaned on my paychecks. They did it so often and so casually that it had stopped even registering as wrong in their minds. Rage washed through me, hot and cold at the same time. Not the kind you throw at someone in a shouting match, but the kind that sinks down into your bones and settles there. It was not just that they had used me. It was that they had done it without ever admitting it, without ever giving me the truth. They had let me think I was choosing to help, when really, they were taking pieces of me without asking. Julia touched my arm gently and asked if I was all right. I took a breath and told her I needed to know everything I could about those accounts. Every date, every address, every place a document had been mailed. She nodded and printed out copies, sliding them across the desk toward me. Her printer hummed and clicked, spitting out pages that might as well have been pages from a history book. I had never been allowed to read. As I gathered the papers into a folder, my phone started buzzing on the desk. The number was unfamiliar again, but this time it was one I recognized from earlier. Reno. My heartbeat picked up, tapping faster in my chest. Julie Dahl paused and looked at me, eyebrows raised just slightly. I picked up the phone and answered. The same measured voice came through. Officer Daniel Rourke. He asked if it was a good time to talk. I told him I was with my attorney, but that I could listen. He hesitated for just a second, then said there was another name I needed to hear. A young man named Garrett Brooks. He said Garrett was not just some ex-boyfriend of my sister's, not just another bad choice in a line of bad choices. Garrett was connected to a refund scam they had been tracking for months. And Ethan, my brother, might be tied to it as well. He told me I needed to hear the full story, in person, as soon as possible. I felt the folder grow heavier in my lap, full of proof that my brother had already been stealing parts of my life for years. Now the officer was telling me that was only one piece of something bigger, something darker, something that reached far beyond a single night in a Reno club. I looked across the desk at Julia, who watched my face carefully and knew that whatever came next would demand more from me than money had ever done. He told me I needed to hear the full story in person, and then the line went quiet. Within an hour, Julia had shifted a few meetings and booked us both on the next flight to Reno. She looked at me over the top of her glasses and said in that no-nonsense way she had always had, that I was not going to walk into this alone. I did not argue. The idea of sitting in some police station by myself, listening to strangers unravel my family, made my skin crawl. The flight was short, but it felt strangely long. Out the window, the mountains rolled by, patchy with snow and dark trees, then flattened into the dry winter browns of Nevada. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the folder of documents tucked under my arm like armor. Julia went over a simple checklist with me. What we knew, what we suspected, what we could prove. I heard her words, but my mind drifted again and again to Rebecca, sitting in a holding cell somewhere, and to Ethan, wherever he was, probably convincing himself this was all just bad luck. When we landed, the cold in Reno had a different bite to it, sharp and drier than in Denver. The air smelled faintly like dust and exhaust. We picked up a rental car and followed the directions on Julia's phone to the police station. The building itself was plain, low and boxy, with a small flag snapping in the wind out front. Inside the lobby, everything was clean but worn, a lot of gray tile and fluorescent light. Officer Daniel Rourke met us at the front desk. He was taller than I had pictured, with tired blue eyes, and a face that suggested he had seen more than he ever wanted to. His voice in person matched the one on the phone, calm and measured, like he was always careful about where he set his words down. He shook my hand, then Julia's, and led us to a small conference room with a table and 3 chairs. He began by laying out what they already knew. There had been a group of young people, including my sister and a man named Garrett Brooks, who had been coming in and out of a few high-end bars and clubs around Reno and nearby areas for months. Staff knew them as the kids who liked to pretend they were celebrities. Bottle service, expensive cocktails, loud laughter, always recording everything on their phones. They played the part very well, he said. Too well, considering none of them actually had that kind of money. He explained that Garrett was at the center of it. He was the one who liked to promise a good time to anyone willing to follow his lead. He would tell people that life was short and that you had to act like you belonged in the fancy places before those places would ever really open to you. He surrounded himself with people who were young enough and eager enough to believe him. Rebecca had become one of those people. My stomach tightened as he described how she had started tagging along with Garrett and his group on weekends. How she had confessed later that she always felt like the poor kid crashing someone else's party. Ethan had noticed that, the officer said. He had seen how badly she wanted to seem important, so he had stepped in. According to Rebecca's statement, Ethan had visited her on campus a few weeks earlier and taken her out for coffee. He had listened while she talked about Garrett and her new friends and the parties, and how everyone expected her to keep up. Then he pulled a card out of his wallet and slid it across the table to her. She told the officer that he had smiled and told her the card had a huge limit, that she should go enjoy being young. Those big sisters like me had always had life handled, and it was her turn now. I felt something twist inside my chest, half anger, half grief. The officer went on. The card Ethan gave Rebecca was tied to one of the fraudulent accounts Julia had just uncovered in my credit report. The address on file was my parents' house. The name tied to the digital signature was mine. From the bank's perspective, I was the one giving Rebecca a blank check to act like she was living in a music video. Then there was the matter of the ID. Officer Rourke said there had been an earlier incident, a different night at a casino bar when a bouncer had almost turned Rebecca away. She had been with Garrett and a few of his friends. They were all legal drinking age, but the bouncer had hesitated over Rebecca's student ID because it looked too young. They had left without incident, but apparently it had embarrassed her badly. Later, according to messages pulled from Rebecca's phone, Garrett had joked that she should borrow an older identity to match the lifestyle. That was when Ethan had stepped in again. He had access to an old copy of my license that my parents kept in their hallway drawer. With the help of a friend he knew from work, he had turned it into a fake. The face was mine from several years back, but the details were altered just enough to pass as Rebecca. A different hair color, a slightly different height, but my name remained printed in clear letters. To the officer, it was a clear pattern. Ethan had taken my stability and turned it into a tool for Rebecca's insecurity and Garrett's games. I asked if I could see Rebecca. For a moment, he looked uncertain. Then he said he would check. He stepped out for a few minutes and came back saying they could give us a short, monitored conversation. I felt my throat go dry, but I agreed. They brought her into a small room with a table bolted to the floor. She looked smaller than I remembered from the night of Christmas dinner. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. Dark circles smudged the skin under her eyes. She would not quite meet my gaze at first. There was a glass window to one side where I knew someone was watching, but I tried to focus only on her. She started talking before I could. Her words tumbled out in choked bursts. She said she had not known the card was really mine. She said Ethan had told her it was a shared account, that it was family money, that it would not hurt anyone. She said Garrett had teased her that night when the charge was run. He had told her to act confident, to just keep dancing, that everything would go through. She said the club staff had smiled at them all night and then turned cold when the card declined. She told me she had handed over the ID because she had panicked. She had thought using my name would somehow make her more credible, not less. She had never thought about what it meant for me on the other side of that. Text from the bank at 3 a.m. Listening to her, I felt my anger at her start to shift. It did not disappear. She had choices in all of this, and she had chosen badly. But under the bad choices, I could hear something else. A frightened girl reaching for whatever approval she could get. Ethan's assurances. Garrett's charm. The glitter of clubs where everyone pretended to be richer, braver, more loved than they really were. I told her in a slow, steady voice that what she had done was serious. I told her it was my name and my credit she had walked in with. For a moment, she looked like a child again, like the little sister who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. Her eyes filled with tears. She said she had really believed Ethan was helping her. She thought he was the one person in the family who saw her and wanted her to feel special. She never imagined he was using both of us to hide his own mess. When they took her back to her holding area, I sat there for a moment with my hands flat on the table, the metal cold under my palms. I felt like I was looking at a broken puzzle where all the pieces finally belonged to the same box. Ethan at the center, pulling strings. Rebecca on one side, desperate to belong. Me on the other, steady enough to be used as a wall to lean against without ever being asked. Back in the conference room, Officer Rourke cleared his throat and told us there was still more. He opened a thin file and said that Garrett Brooks had been on their radar for some time. He was connected to a pattern of suspicious refunds and chargebacks at several casinos and luxury retailers in the region. They suspected he had been orchestrating purchases and then reversing them, pocketing the difference through a web of fake accounts. Ethan's name had appeared alongside his in a few of those financial trails. Nothing solid enough yet for a full charge, but enough to make the department pay attention. Rebecca's night at the club had simply dragged all of those threads into the same knot. My stolen credit, the fake ID, Garrett's games, Ethan's debts, my parents' desperation. It was all woven together tighter than any of them probably realized. I asked what would happen to Rebecca. The officer said if she cooperated fully, and if this was indeed her first serious offense, there was a chance the district attorney might consider a diversion program instead of a full prosecution. Some kind of counseling, restitution, maybe community service. He said her willingness to tell the truth about what Ethan and Garrett had done would matter a lot. Then he met my eyes in that steady way again, and told me the part I had been, half expecting and dreading at the same time. Etten was being formally summoned to appear the next day for questioning. The department would be reviewing not only his role in Rebecca's case, but also his possible connection to Garrett's wider activities. The officer said I had every right to bring any documentation I had, the credit reports, the bank letters, anything that showed how long this pattern of using my identity had been going on. He said my evidence could be the difference between this being treated as a one-night mistake and being recognized for what it really was. I felt the folder in my lap, heavy with that history, and knew that in less than 24 hours, I was going to sit in another. A room like this one while my brother tried to talk his way out of the truth. I sat there in the small conference room in Reno for a few quiet seconds, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Then Julia touched my arm and said we should drive back before the weather worsened. Snow was expected near the pass, and she did not want us stuck between states with more questions hanging in the air. So we gathered the paperwork, thanked Officer Rourke, and stepped back into the fading afternoon light. The drive to Evergreen the next morning felt heavier than the miles themselves. I had stayed the night at a hotel off the highway, too restless to go home to Denver and too drained to risk staying near Reno. Julia had offered to come with me to confront Ethan again, but I told her this part I needed to do alone. She squeezed my hand before leaving and said to call her the moment things turned sideways. We both knew they would. Evergreen looked almost peaceful under the thin blanket of snow that had fallen overnight. The pine trees bowed with the weight of it. The rooftops glowed soft white in the morning sun. If a stranger drove through, they would think this town was nothing but warmth and simple living. They would never imagine that inside one particular house, near the edge of the flat, the woods, an entire family was sitting on a pile of secrets, ready to split open. I parked in the same driveway I had pulled into after Christmas dinner. The tire tracks from days earlier had frozen into ridges. My stomach tightened as I walked to the door. I let myself in. My parents never locked it during the day. Ethan was at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone like nothing in the world could touch him. My mom was at the sink rinsing a mug. My dad was reading the newspaper, pretending not to notice the tension that swept in with me. The familiar ache moved through my chest. I stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to acknowledge me. No one did. I pulled out a chair across from Ethan and sat down. He looked up with a slow smirk, like he was annoyed I had interrupted whatever he was watching. I asked him to explain what he had done. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, and shrugged. I had seen that shrug 1,000 times throughout our childhood. The one that said he was confident he could charm, dodge, or bully his way past any accountability. He told me I was overreacting, that what happened with Rebecca was nothing but a misunderstanding. Clubs were dramatic, he said. They exaggerated everything for attention. I said that was not what the police had told me. He waved a hand and said police officers loved making things sound worse than they were. He told me families stick together and protect each other. He said that was my role in this family, that it always had been. His voice held an edge, a tone that made my skin prickle. He said that if I really wanted to help Rebecca, I would send the $20,000 so they could pay off the club and keep her record clean. He said one mistake at her age could ruin her life. My mom backed him up instantly. Her voice trembled with practiced emotion. She said I had always been the responsible one, and responsible people made sacrifices. She said the club would drop everything if we paid them. My dad folded his newspaper and nodded without looking directly at me. He said, sometimes you do not question. You just take care of your own. I stared at them all and felt something inside me shift. It was not anger, exactly, more like an old scar tearing open to reveal the wound had never healed. I reminded Ethan that he had used my name to open credit lines, that he had stolen my identity, that he had dragged Rebecca into this because it suited him. He shrugged again and said he had only used my ID a few times. No big deal. We were family. Families shared things. I told him credit histories were not holiday leftovers. They did not get passed around like a casserole dish. He smirked and told me I was dramatic. He said if anyone came asking questions, I should calm down and act like a supportive sister. He said if I stopped making a fuss, none of this would touch me. Another shrug. Another dismissal. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, my mind drifted to a memory so old and so familiar, it almost felt like it happened in someone else's life. I was 19, juggling 3 jobs, waiting tables at night, working part-time at the library in the afternoons, doing data entry on my old laptop until 2 in the morning. All so I could help cover bills my parents could not handle. Bills Ethan had helped create, but never had to face. I remembered my dad patting my shoulder and telling me that this was what the oldest children did. I remembered Ethan laughing with his friends, driving a car I had helped pay for. I remembered handing over my entire paycheck to cover the electricity bill one month, while he bragged about a weekend away. The ache inside me deepened. That ache was older than Rebecca's mistakes, older than the credit lines, older than the fake ID. It had lived under my ribs since childhood. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor, sharp in the quiet kitchen. I said if Ethan wanted to explain himself, that was his moment. If my parents wanted to justify what they had allowed, that was their moment too. But no one spoke. My dad kept staring at his folded newspaper. My mom dried her hands on a towel without turning. Ethan smirked at the table like he had already won. My phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, I thought maybe it was Julia checking in, or Officer Rourke calling with a change in tomorrow's schedule. I stepped back from the table and pulled out my phone. It was an email from the Human Resources Department at my company. The subject line was requested for immediate explanation. I opened it. My breath caught. They had received several complaints. Screenshots of Rebecca's live stream where she had cried in a restroom and said her older sister would rather watch her suffer than help her. Viewers had commented with my full name, my workplace, my job title. Someone had emailed my employer directly, accusing me of neglect, cruelty, and misconduct. Human Resources wanted to discuss the situation within 24 hours. I closed the email slowly. In that moment, the kitchen grew smaller, tighter, like the walls were inching closer. My family did not look up. They had no idea what that email meant. They did not care to ask. They only cared about the $20,000 they still expected me to hand over. I looked at each of them, one by one. The brother who had stolen from me. The mom who cried on cue. The dad who treated Ethan's mistakes like unfortunate weather. And all I felt was an exhausted clarity. I turned and walked toward the front door. My dad said nothing. My mom let out a small, wounded sound. Ethan muttered something under his breath that I did not bother to decipher. Outside, the cold air hit my cheeks. I stood by my car and stared at the snow piled gently along the edge of the car driveway. The mountains beyond the trees looked pale blue against the winter sky. I unlocked the car and slipped inside. I sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel while my phone buzzed, again with another work notification. My reputation, my name, my job, the life I had built piece by piece through years of sacrifice, was suddenly under attack because my family wanted me to clean up their mess one more time. I started the engine. I did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring when Ethan faced questioning. But for the first time, I knew something with absolute certainty. I was done letting them shape the story. I pulled out of the driveway and watched the house shrink in my rear window as a new kind of fear and a new kind of resolve settled hard and steady in my chest. I drove the winding road out of Evergreen with the engine humming low beneath, me and my thoughts moving too fast to catch. The snow thickened as I climbed toward the highway, little white flecks streaking across the windshield, like my life was being erased and rewritten in the same breath. By the time I reached Denver, the sun had dipped behind the Front Range, and the city lights were beginning to glow like a scattered constellation across the dark. I parked in my usual spot outside my apartment building, but I did not get out. Right away, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, the lingering chill from Evergreen still clinging to my fingers. My phone buzzed again with another email notification from work. The knot in my stomach pulled tight. I finally forced myself out of the car and took the elevator up, feeling each floor climb like another layer of pressure settling on me. The next morning, I walked into the office early, long before most of the team arrived. The halls were quiet. The kind of quiet that always felt both peaceful and ominous. I made myself a cup of coffee in the break room, but even the familiar smell did nothing to steady my nerves. My meeting with Human Resources was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. At 8:57, I walked into the small, glass-walled conference room, where Denise Holloway, the head of HR, sat waiting. She was usually warm and encouraging, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought cookies to staff meetings. Today she looked tired, tense. She motioned for me to sit. She started slowly. She said the company valued me. She said I had been one of the strongest engineers on our team for years. She said she admired my dedication. Then she opened a folder on the table and slid a printed screenshot toward me. It was Rebecca's live stream. Her tear-streaked face, her shaking voice, her words accusing me of leaving her to be humiliated alone in a police station hallway. Denise said the video had been shared widely. Some viewers had emailed the company. A few had posted angry comments on our project pages. She said they were concerned about brand reputation, especially with the large municipal contract we were about to finalize. She said that while she understood this was a family matter, the online attention was making the leadership nervous. I told her the truth. I told her Rebecca's livestream was missing context, that the situation was tied to identity theft, financial fraud, and a police investigation, that everything Rebecca had said in her video had come from panic and pressure and a lifetime of family dysfunction. Denise listened. She believed more than she said, I could tell, but she also looked trapped in her role. She reminded me that companies worry about appearances. She said that even when employees are victims, messy family scandals can spill into public view in ways organizations cannot control. She said the leadership team wanted an explanation in writing. She said we needed to get ahead of this before it touched the city project. I nodded and felt something inside me sink a little lower. I had worked my entire adult life to build a reputation for reliability, integrity, and strength. And now that reputation was being threatened by the very people I had sacrificed most for. The door suddenly opened. Sophie Caldwell stepped in without knocking. She was a project manager I had worked with for years, sharp as a tack, unshakably loyal, and never afraid to speak uncomfortable truths. She asked if she could join. Denise agreed. Sophie sat down and said she had seen the live stream. She said she had already emailed leadership to vouch for my character. She told Denise that I was the first to volunteer for overtime when deadlines were tight. The one who caught errors before they became disasters. The one who covered for others without being asked. She said that whatever was happening in my family had nothing to do with the kind of colleague or engineer I was. Her voice was steady, protective, and fierce in a way that made my throat tighten. For a moment, I could not speak. Denise thanked her, but said the company still needed documentation, anything that could help them understand the situation if further complaints came in. She said this was not disciplinary action, but it could become one if the story grew louder online. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my desk feeling both shaken and steadied. Shaken because my job, the one place in my life where I felt secure and respected, was suddenly vulnerable. Steadied because Sophie had stood by me without hesitation, even when my own family never had. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering everything I had. I printed the credit reports Julia had shown me. I organized the messages from my parents demanding money. The screenshots of Ethan's name linked to fraudulent accounts. The reverse mortgage statement my parents had never told me about. The voicemail recordings where my mom begged and my dad threatened. I stacked each piece of evidence in a neat pile and slid it into a binder. I sat back in my chair as the office lights flickered on automatically with the fading daylight. Outside the windows, Denver glowed against the blue-gray sky. I felt tired down to my bones, but determined. If my family had dragged me into a public mess, I would not drown quietly under it. I would bring every truth forward, even the ones I had spent years trying not to see. My phone rang just as I zipped the binder shut. It was Julia. Her voice was low, controlled, but there was something urgent beneath it. She said she had spoken to Officer Rourke. Ethan had not shown up voluntarily for preliminary questioning. They had picked him up instead. He was being held until the full interview tomorrow. She said we needed to get back to Reno by morning and prepare for the hearing. I sat there holding the phone against my ear, the office now almost empty around me. Ethan was finally in a place he could not shrug away, dismiss, or charm himself out of. The reality of what he had done was settling around him like cold water. I told Julia I would meet her at the airport at dawn. When I hung up, I pressed my palms flat on the cool desk surface and let the breath I had been holding slowly leave my chest. The day had started with a threat to my career and was ending with the first real crack forming in the shield Ethan had used his entire life. I turned off my computer, gathered the binder, and walked toward the elevator. My chance to finally confront the truth under the full light of the law was waiting in Reno. And I knew, deep in the center of my chest, that everything after tomorrow would look different. The next morning came faster than my mind could catch up. One moment, I was lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, listening to the hum of the heater, and the next, I was dragging my suitcase through the quiet Denver airport, the sky outside still ink black and heavy. Julia met me at the security line with a travel mug in one hand and her briefcase in the other. She gave me a look that said she knew I had not slept much either. The flight to Reno felt suspended in its own strange pocket of time. The plane climbed above the clouds, and the world outside turned into a blank, white sheet. I watched the wing cut through that emptiness and thought about how many times I had bailed my family out without ever making them look at the damage up close. This time would be different. This time there would be a room and a record and a judge who did not care about family stories, only facts. By the time we drove to the Washoe County Courthouse, the winter sun was up, but struggling to pierce the thin gray clouds. The building rose ahead of us, all square lines and pale stone, not grand, but solid, in a way that made my stomach twist. Inside, the air smelled like paper and old dust, and a faint hint of coffee that had been sitting too long. People moved through the lobby with that particular courthouse mixture of nerves and boredom. We checked in with the clerk and followed a deputy down a narrow hallway to a small courtroom. It was not like the ones you see in movies. No towering ceilings or dramatic chandeliers, just rows of wooden benches, a low rail, and a bench at the front where the judge would sit. A seal hung on the wall behind it. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Rebecca sat at a table near the front. She wore the same clothes I had seen her in at the station, but somebody had given her a cardigan. It hung off her shoulders like she was a child dressed in borrowed clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that did nothing to hide how swollen her eyes were. She looked up as I walked in, and for a brief second, something like hope flickered across her face. Then my parents walked in behind me, and the air in the room changed. Mom clutched her purse to her chest as if it were a life raft. Her eyes flitted around the room, landing everywhere except on me. Dad's jaw was clenched so hard I could see the tendons in his neck. He did not look at me either, just walked straight to the bench behind Rebecca and sat down, his hand resting on the back of her chair in a silent gesture of ownership. Ethan arrived last, escorted by a deputy. He wore his nicest jeans and a button-down shirt, but the effect was dulled by the cuff marks around his wrists, where the handcuffs had been removed. For the first time in a long time, he did not walk into a room like he owned it. He threw a quick look at my parents, then at me, then quickly away, his mouth tightening. Julia and I took our seats at a separate table reserved for interested parties. She laid out the binder between us and placed a small notepad beside it. Her calm steadiness grounded me a little. I focused on her presence and tried not to let my eyes drift toward the judgment in my parents' faces. The bailiff called the room to attention when Judge Alan Keating entered. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with silver hair and deep lines around his mouth that suggested he had spent years listening to people lie to him. His gaze swept the courtroom and settled briefly on each of us, taking in more than he said. He began by reviewing the basics. There was a charge against Rebecca for presenting fraudulent identification and failing to pay a significant club bill, with the added complication that the identification belonged to an older sibling who had not given consent. There was an ongoing investigation into possible financial crimes involving her brother Ethan and a man named Garrett Brooks. Today's hearing would not resolve every aspect, but would address immediate concerns and determine the next steps. The prosecutor spoke first, outlining how Rebecca had walked into the club with a card that did not belong to her and an ID that was not truly hers. She described the $7,500 tab, the declined charge, the bank notice, the staff's call to the police. She mentioned that the card was linked to accounts that appeared to have been opened using identity information from the older sister, me, without authorization. Then it was my turn. Julia nudged the binder closer, and the judge asked if I wished to present information. My legs felt stiff as I stood. I carried the binder to the front and placed it on the evidence table with hands that only shook a little. I explained as plainly as I could that accounts had been opened in my name from my parents' address, that I had never authorized them, that the pattern of charges and payments matched the financial chaos I had been unknowingly propping up for years. I told him about the credit report Julia had pulled, the delinquency notice I had found, the reverse mortgage my parents had taken out without ever mentioning it to me. I slid forward copies of the letters, the credit statements, the bank notifications from the night of the club charge. The judge leafed through them slowly, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor took notes. Ethan stared at the table. Mom covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling. But still, she did not look at me. When I described how Ethan had given Rebecca a card tied to one of those fraudulent accounts, something in the room shifted. Judge Keating asked Ethan directly whether he had done so. Ethan cleared his throat, tried to smile, and said he had only wanted to help his little sister have a good time. He said he had not realized there was anything wrong with the card. He said Garrett had handled the details. He tried to lean on that word mistake like it would save him. The prosecutor asked whether he had accessed his sister's old identification. Then he admitted he had used it a couple of times to help Rebecca get in, places where she felt out of place. He said he did not see what the big deal was. He said families shared, and besides, everyone exaggerated what had really happened at the club. His tone was casual, edging on irritated, as if the whole proceeding was an inconvenience. The judge listened without reacting, then turned back to the documents. He asked the prosecutor about the connection to Garrett. She explained that financial records showed a pattern of purchases and refunds using overlapping accounts, some in Garrett's name, some not, some tied to Ethan's employment information, and some tied to my stolen identity. It was not yet a complete picture, but it was enough to indicate that Ethan was a central figure, not just an innocent brother. Rebecca began to cry quietly at the table. At first, it was just a shimmer in her eyes. Then a small sound escaped her, and soon tears were slipping down her cheeks unchecked. She turned in her chair to look at me fully for the first time that day. The apology in her face was so raw it hurt to see it. She asked the judge if she could speak. He allowed it. Her voice shook as she admitted that she had believed Ethan when he told her. The card was safe to use. She said she honestly thought I had agreed to it, that Ethan had told her it was family money, and that I would be fine. She said she had wanted so badly to impress her friends, to keep up with the image Garrett and his crowd projected, that she had ignored the knot in her stomach when she handed over that fake ID. She turned back to me and said she was sorry. Not dramatic, not practiced, just small and broken. She said she had never meant to drag my name through the mud, at work, or online, or in that club. She had thought she was borrowing some of my strength. She had not realized how much of it I had already been forced to give. My eyes burned, but I held her gaze and nodded just once. I could not erase what she had done, but I could see clearly now that Ethan had laid the path for her feet and then stepped back to let her take the fall. That was when my dad surged to his feet. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction, and his voice came out louder than it had any right to be in that quiet room. He said I was destroying the family. He said airing dirty laundry like this in front of strangers was unforgivable. He said I had always thought I was better than them because I moved to Denver and got a degree and a fancy job. And now here I was, throwing my brother under the bus to make myself look righteous. The bailiff took a step forward, but the judge lifted a hand and told my dad to sit down. My dad did not. He kept talking, the words spilling out full of fury and humiliation and the desperate need to blame someone other than the son he had spent a lifetime protecting. All the eyes in the room shifted between us. I felt something in me harden. I told my dad in a voice that stayed steady that I was not destroying them. Family. I was protecting myself because no one else ever had. I said I had spent years patching holes in a ship I did not poke the first hole in. I said he had chosen, over and over again, to shield Ethan from consequences and to use me as the invisible safety net. The judge intervened then, his tone firm. He reminded everyone that this was not a therapy session. It was a legal proceeding. He called for order and waited until my dad sank slowly back into his seat, muttering under his breath. After that, the room felt different, lighter in a strange way, as if the truth had finally been pulled out from under the table where everyone had been pretending not to see it. The judge took a moment, looking from Ethan to Rebecca to me, and then to my parents. He said the evidence showed a clear pattern of misuse of identity and credit tied to Ethan, with Rebecca caught up in the fallout. He said the full investigation into the broader financial scheme with Garrett Brooks would continue, and that more serious charges might follow. For now, he ruled that Ethan would be placed into a mandatory financial accountability and rehabilitation program, supervised by the court while investigators dug deeper. He would be restricted from opening or accessing any new lines of credit and would be required to attend regular sessions and submit detailed financial reports. As for Rebecca, he acknowledged her cooperation and her limited role. He said she would be accepted into a diversion program, focusing on decision-making, financial literacy, and counseling. If she completed it fully and complied with all requirements, the charge related to the ID might be reduced or dismissed. She still had to face restitution to the club, but the path in front of her was not a cell. It was a hard lesson and a second chance. My parents sat frozen. My mom finally looked at me, but I could not read her expression. It was some tangled mixture of anger, grief, fear, and something that might have been realization. The judge wrapped up the hearing, setting dates for follow-up reviews. The bailiff called for us to stand as he exited. The room relaxed by slow degrees as people shuffled papers and gathered belongings. As I turned to collect the binder from the table, I heard my dad's voice behind me. It was quieter now, but somehow heavier than his earlier shouting. He told me that from this day forward, I was no longer his daughter. The words settled over the back of my neck like a cold hand. For a second, I could not move. The room around me blurred at the edges. I felt Julia's presence at my side, solid and calm, and I straightened slowly, the binder pressed against my chest like a shield. I walked toward the exit without looking back at him, knowing that a line had just been drawn that could never be erased. I left the courthouse with my dad's words still ringing in the back of my mind, but instead of breaking me open, they settled inside me like something old and finished. The flight back to Denver was quiet. Julia worked through emails beside me, and I stared out the window at the clouds, feeling a strange, heavy calm. My family had always treated me like a tool, a resource, a name to sign on the dotted line whenever their problems overflowed. Hearing my dad disown me felt less like a wound and more like a confirmation of what had been true for a long time. Back in Denver, the rhythm of work and normal life steadied me for a few days. I spent lunch with Sophie, who refused to let me drift into silence. HR had accepted my documentation and promised to monitor the situation. Still, the weight of everything lingered in the corners of my apartment like a draft I could not fully shut out. Then word from Evergreen began trickling in. My aunt from Colorado Springs called first. She spoke in a whisper, saying the entire town was buzzing about Ethan's investigation. People in my parents' church had begun asking if the rumors were true. Someone had seen the sheriff's car parked outside the house. My mom had been spotted at the hardware store, looking hollowed out. My dad, she said, walk around town with his shoulders tight and his chin high, like a man refusing to see the storm behind him. That same afternoon, a neighbor I barely remembered sent me a photo. A foreclosure notice, taped right across the front door of the house I grew up in. 45 days, the letter said, before the bank took possession due to unpaid reverse mortgage debt. I stared at the picture for a long time. Snow dusted the porch, a porch where Rebecca used to color with chalk, and where I had sat with textbooks and fast food dinners the year I worked 3 jobs. That porch now carried a warning my parents had signed into existence. I did not feel satisfied. Mostly, I felt tired. That house had never been mine to lose, and yet I had been the one expected to save it. Mom began calling again after that. I blocked 2 numbers, then 3. She left voicemails that swung between sobbing and cold accusations. She said if I had any compassion, I would come home and fix this. She said I had turned my back on my family when they needed me most. She said, what kind of daughter walks away while the roof falls in? I deleted the messages, but some slipped through long enough for her words to cling to the inside of my mind. I had spent my entire life trying to be the daughter she wanted. Now she wanted someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. A few days later, my phone lit up with an Arizona area code. It was Grandma Clara. Her voice was weaker than I remembered, but steady enough to cut through everything. She said she had heard pieces of the story and felt ashamed she had not seen sooner how badly I had been treated. Then she told me about the will. Years ago, she and my grandfather had planned to split their estate equally among their grandchildren. But when the papers came back after his death, the distributions had been changed. Ethan would receive the majority, Rebecca a modest sum. My name was nearly absent. When she asked my dad about it, he said the lawyers advised them to consolidate assets and that he would divide things later. Grieving and overwhelmed, she believed him. Now she suspected he had used her trust the same way he had used mine. I thanked her with a tightness in my throat I could hardly swallow down. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the simple ache of having someone in my family truly on my side. 2 mornings later, there was a soft knock on my apartment door. Rebecca stood in the hall, holding a small overnight bat, her shoulders curled inward like she was bracing against wind. When I stepped aside, she walked in quietly, glancing around my home with the hesitation of someone entering a church. She sat at the table and folded her hands, then unfolded them, then finally whispered that she was sorry again. But this time, her apology was different. The panic was gone. What remained was honesty. She said her sessions with the diversion counselor had forced her to look at her life. Really look at it. She said she had spent years letting Ethan define what mattered. She had wanted his approval so badly, she let herself be pulled into every lie he told. She admitted that he had shaped the way she saw me, painting me as controlling, rigid, someone to resent rather than admire. She looked up then, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. She said she did not expect forgiveness quickly. She said she did not even know who she was without Ethan's voice in her ear, without our parents defining her worth. She just knew she wanted to change. She wanted to learn how to make decisions that did not hinge on someone else's wishes. She did not want to be their puppet anymore. Something in me softened. I had been so angry at her, hurt, betrayed, but now she looked more like the little sister who used to climb into my bed after nightmares, needing comfort more than anything. I told her the truth. Trust would take time, but I wanted her to find her own life, not the shadow Ethan had cast over her. When she left, she hugged me at the door. It was brief, but real. 2 days later, I found an envelope in my mailbox addressed in my dad's tight, angular handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message telling me never to come back home. He wrote that I had betrayed him, embarrassed Ethan, and destroyed the family. He said I was no longer welcome. At the bottom, he had written, "Do not return." I set the letter on the counter and stood there for a long time. I waited for heartbreak, for the familiar sting of failing to meet their expectations. But nothing came. It was as if all the guilt I had carried for 36 years had finally burned itself out. Later that afternoon, I drove to Julia's office. She was sitting behind her desk with a stack of files spread open in front of it, her. When she saw me, she gestured to me, her expression serious. She said she had been digging through public records after our last meeting, looking for anything else tied to my name. Then she slid a photocopy toward me. It was a loan document from 2018, a bank I had never done business with, a signature that was supposed to be mine. But the moment I examined it, I saw the difference. The way the letters slanted, the shape of the final loop. My dad's handwriting, wearing a mask shaped like mine. Julia said she had no doubt the signature was forged. She said it changed the picture, that this was not just a negligent parent, but a deliberate pattern of using my identity to buffer the family's financial choices. She said I needed to decide whether I wanted to pursue charges. I stared at the paper. Everything inside me went still. My dad had once told me that family sticks together. Now I realized he meant family sticks together as long as I remained silent, obedient, and useful. I told Julia I wanted to go to Evergreen one more time. She asked if I was sure. I nodded. I said this was not about persuading anyone or fixing anything. This was about looking my parents in the eye and telling them I would not carry their damage anymore. I would not be their bank account, their scapegoat, their insurance policy, not ever again. When I stepped out of her building, the winter sky was bright and cold, the air sharp in my lungs. I walked toward my car with a clarity I had never felt before. The next time I drove into Evergreen, it would not be as their daughter trying to fit into a role they had written for me. It would be as a woman standing on her own feet, ready to say goodbye on her own terms. I drove toward Evergreen with a steadiness I had never felt on that road before. The mountains rose on either side of me, sharp against the winter sky, and the closer I got to my parents' house, the clearer my thoughts became. This was not a rescue mission. This was closure. I parked at the curb and stepped out into the cold air. The house looked smaller than I remembered, almost timid, behind the foreclosure notice still taped to the front door. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the scent of pine and snow, letting myself feel the weight of the years that had brought me back to this moment. Inside, the living room was dim, lit only by a small lamp near the couch. My dad sat stiffly in his old recliner, arms crossed, as if bracing himself for a fight he was already certain he would win. My mom sat beside him, shoulders hunched, hair messy, eyes red. Ethan leaned against the wall behind them, hands in his pockets, looking older than his 33 years, a man carrying consequences for the first time in his life. Julia walked in behind me, folder in hand. No one greeted her. No one greeted me either. The silence felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. My dad spoke first. His voice was sharp, almost brittle. He said that if I was here to apologize for what I did in court, I could turn around right now. He said he would not accept it anyway. I looked at him. really looked at him, and felt that familiar hollow place inside me widen. Then I told him, calm and steady, that I was not there to apologize. Julia stepped forward and opened the folder, placing a printed loan document on the coffee table. My dad glanced at it, then looked away as if it were an annoying piece of junk mail. Julia explained that this document carried a forged signature, mine, dated 2018, tied to a loan I never agreed to, and a bank I had never used. She said the writing matched his pattern, not mine. My mom gasped softly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. My dad barely blinked. He said everyone exaggerated everything. He said people in our family always helped each other. He said it was just a small signature, nothing more. My mom whispered his name like a plea, but he did not look at her. Julia laid out the next piece of evidence, the delinquency notice from 2020, addressed to me but intercepted at their house. Then the email confirmation for credit lines linked to my Social Security number. Then a signature comparison analysis. Then the photo of last week's foreclosure notice. My dad sat there, tightening his jaw with each page she turned. My mom began to shake, tears sliding down her cheeks. Ethan stared at the floor. The way a child might look at a broken toy, he finally realized he could not fix. When Julia was done, I stepped forward. My voice felt steadier than it had in years. I said that I knew everything now. The accounts in my name, the loans, the signatures, the choices they had made while pretending I was selfish for trying to live my own life. I said I had spent years working overtime, taking extra shifts, sacrificing vacations and holidays because I thought I was helping a family that loved me. But now I saw I had been used. My dad shot up from his recliner and demanded to know what I planned to do. He asked if I was calling the police next, if I was here to humiliate him again, if I wanted to destroy the rest of what little they had left. I stood my ground. I told him no, I was not filing criminal charges. I said he would face the financial consequences of his choices, but I would not drag him through another courtroom. I said the simple truth was enough. The truth is that from this moment on, I did not belong in this house anymore. My mom let out a sound that was almost a wail. She reached toward me, begging me to stay, begging me to understand, begging me to believe she did not know everything my dad had done. But the years had worn away the place inside me where her pleas used to land. I told her I hoped she found peace, but I could not carry her grief anymore. Ethan finally raised his head. His face was drained of all the cocky confidence he used to wear like a jacket. He said he never meant to ruin my life. He said he thought he could fix things before I ever found out. He said he thought I was strong enough to handle the fallout. I told him strength was not an excuse for theft, or deceit, or betrayal. He nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence he had secretly known was coming all along. There was nothing left to say after that. I walked toward the door. Julifa followed quietly. Behind me, I heard my mom crying, my dad cursing, and Ethan whispering something I could not make out. I did not turn around. 2 weeks later, the Whitford house was emptied. The shutters were closed. The yard was overgrown. A rental sign hung at the edge of the driveway where Ethan once played basketball. Word reached me that my parents had moved into a small rental across town. Ethan lost his job at the auto shop when the owner learned of the investigation. He was required to attend mandatory financial accountability sessions 3 times a week and repay part of the fraudulent debt. Mom picked up part-time work at a senior center. Dad refused to speak to anyone about what happened. Karma had arrived in its own quiet, steady way, one consequence at a time. Rebecca entered her counseling and mentoring program in Reno. A month into it, I got an email from her, short and careful. She wrote that she finally understood how deeply our family's patterns had shaped her, how far she had drifted from who she wanted to be. She thanked me for not abandoning her, even when she had made that so difficult. She said she hoped that one day, when she had healed enough, we could start over as adults instead of the shadows of our past. I sat at my kitchen table and read her message twice. Then I sent her a reply telling her I was proud of her. That was enough for now. Life in Denver began to feel different in ways I had not expected. I signed a lease on a new apartment with a balcony that faced the mountains. The first night I slept there, I left the living room curtains open just to see the sunrise light up the snow. Sophie and Julia came over one Saturday morning. We drank coffee and sat on my balcony wrapped in blankets, doing about everything and nothing. I felt a kind of peace I had never known in my parents' house, a peace that came from choosing a life instead of surviving one. There were moments when grief caught up to me, moments when I remembered holidays at the old house, or the way I used to hope my dad would be proud of me. But grief no longer owned me. It just passed through, leaving room for something steadier. As winter turned toward spring, I realized I had reached the end of a long and painful road. I had confronted the truth. I had chosen myself. I had stepped out of a story that was never written for my benefit, and for the first time in my life, the next chapter belonged entirely to me. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.